Good morning everybody. Today I'm going to host a session to discuss simplified due diligence. On the back of the most recent NRA, we felt it was prudent to do a refresh on this topic. So I'm going to start by looking at the risk-based approach, just to do a bit of a recap, and then I'll move on to consider some of the varying simplified measures we permit under the AML CFT code. Strictly, under the FATF international standards, some of the concessions I'll talk about today are exemptions, in that they maybe allow a firm not to do something as another entity has already undertaken the CDD, for example, and some concessions are a simplified measure, where on a risk basis a simplified or more proportionate measure can be taken. I am going to start by just doing a recap on what we mean by risk-based approach. So the FSA supervises on a risk-based approach, and it permits firms to apply the code on a risk-based approach. This relates to, firstly, identifying the ML, TF and PF risks, assessing and understanding those risks, and then applying controls and resources proportionate to the level of risk. Considering due diligence, there are then certain simplified or enhanced measures that can be taken, dependent on the assessed risk. So I am just going to turn to the international standards for a moment, and I have included an extract here from the FATF methodology, which states that where higher risks are identified, enhanced measures should be applied. Correspondingly, where risks are lower, countries should allow and encourage financial institutions and DNFBPs to apply simplified measures. And then I've also just included an extract from the FATF guidance on financial inclusion, which is designed to ensure customers who may not have full customary due diligence available for various reasons do have an opportunity to access financial services. And it again encourages that use of simplified measures. So it is simplified measures we're going to focus on today, and we are going to firstly just talk through the starting point, which is the National Risk Assessment. The National Risk Assessment, it's recently been refreshed. This should be used to inform your BRA, your Business Risk Assessment. So while mentioning the NRA, there is a section in there which talks about simplified measures offered by the Isle of Man AML CFT framework and the associated risks of the same. So I would look at the BRA and have a look at that section specifically on simplified measures. But as per the AML CFT code, you are required to have a BRA by paragraph 5 of the code, and this should be identifying your firm level risks. The NRA should feed in to your BRA, so consider the relevant national and sectoral and firm level risks. So in order to use the risk-based approach and to use simplified measures, which we're going to come to, you must have identified and assessed the risks. You can then consider what procedures and controls should be implemented, and therefore whether the use of a simplified measure might be appropriate. And also just a reminder to consider customer risk and technology risk, which should also feed into your BRA. So what is the aim of simplified measures? Why is it important? Well, ultimately, it's trying to reduce barriers for low-risk individuals, encourage participation in the regulated financial system, and for firms, it allows your focus to be on your higher risk customers and really implement that risk-based approach. I think it's important just to mention, lower risk does not mean no risk, hence there are still CDD measures, but the code allows simplification of these where deemed appropriate and where you've done the appropriate risk assessment and documented and justified the same. So I would recommend having a look at part 6 of the AML CFT code and the corresponding section of the handbook. And what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to run through some examples from the code. I'm keeping this quite high level because there are a number of examples in a number of different areas, and really they're relevant to different sectors as well. So please do see the code, see the handbook for more details. So each of these simplified measures does have their own prescribed conditions to permit usage. I'm going to just cover them in chronological order, beginning with paragraph 11. So this is exempted occasional transaction, and this is where a transaction is below a threshold, and this is allowed in certain sectors. So you must still identify the customer, which means gathering information on the customer. But if the conditions are met, you do not need to verify this customer information. And this is due to the transaction being below a designated threshold. So the example I've just popped on the slide is there is a exempted occasional transaction concession in respect of €5,000 where it is accepted by a foreign exchange provider. So moving on to the next concession, it is paragraph 16 of the code, acceptable applicants. This provides that a customer's identity does not need to be verified, but certain conditions must be met. The customer itself must be acting on their own behalf. So the example I've given on the slide is if you had a regulated person come to you for a service and they're acting on their own behalf, provided the conditions are met, you do not need to verify their identity. So one of the conditions is it could be a company listed on a stock exchange, and it's where actually somebody else has done the verification on their identity, but all other parts of the code continue to apply. Moving on to paragraph 17 of the code, this is called persons acting on behalf of a third party, often just known as AOBO, acting on behalf of. And this concession is where there are a pool of underlying clients and they are being provided a service by a regulated person. The receiving regulated person only needs to verify the identity of the regulated service provider instead of all of the underlying clients. An example of this one might be where there are a number of investors into a fund. The regulated person providing services to that fund only needs to identify and verify the identity of the fund itself, rather than looking through to the underlying investors. As in this example, the fund will have had to do that under the code anyway. There are a lot of conditions around the use of paragraph 17, including testing requirements. So this is definitely one where I would read up on it in the handbook, just to get familiar with all of those conditions. There also needs to be a terms of business in place. Okay, so moving on to paragraph 18. This is specifically designed for designated businesses, hence it's called generic designated business. And this is designed for when a DNFBP does not participate in a financial transaction and it does not administer customer funds. So for example, it could be an accountancy firm providing financial advice, but it is not undertaking any kind of transaction for a customer. In this case, you must identify the customer, and the other areas of the code apply, but you do not need to verify their identity as long as the transaction is meeting the definition of generic designated business. Paragraph 19, eligible introducer. This is where a financial institution or a designated business can basically rely on another regulated person to do the identity and the verification of the customer and hold on to that information and documentation for you. Again, with this one, similar to paragraph 17, there are quite significant conditions around using this simplified measure. There has to be a terms of business in place, and again, there's regular testing required. As part of that testing, there are certain circumstances where you do need to provide the ID and V to the customer that is relying on you. So that is eligible introducer in a nutshell, really. Some of these are quite complicated. You do need to have a look at the handbook for further information. So I am going to just move on to look at paragraph 20. Not going to spend too much time on paragraph 20. It's very specific to insurance, and it is specific to the conditions around it are specific to certain insurers and certain premium values. And it permits an insurer to either not undertake CDD requirements in certain circumstances or to defer compliance until there's a payout. So just a couple of examples. This can be applicable to where there's an annual premium less than €1,000 or where there's no surrender nor a maturity value. And this particular paragraph of the code with the insurance concessions is explained in the insurance sector-specific guidance document. So I now have a group that I've called miscellaneous here. They are within, some of them are within the same paragraphs of the code. They're grouped together. The first being pension schemes, and I've just paraphrased sort of the titles here, but this is where a financial institution or a DNFBP may treat the employer, so the employer that's running the scheme, as the customer, rather than having to do identity and verification checks on all of the underlying scheme members, because there could be quite a lot of employees in that scheme. Again, there's a number of conditions to be met. And a similar provision within the same paragraph relates to collective investment schemes, whereby if the collective investment scheme is your customer, you can treat them as your customer rather than doing ID&V on all of the underlying investors. Paragraph 22 of the code is called transfer of a block of business. This is covering where a group of customers is being transferred from one business to another, and really a bedding in period is needed to allow for that transfer, really recognising that it could be transferring quite a number of customers, and realistically and pragmatically you can't meet the code on day one for all of those customers. So what this concession allows is it allows CDD to be initially obtained from the vendor, therefore giving the purchaser a little bit more time to embed those new customers into their business. This concession really only concerns the CDD. As with any new business relationship or occasional transaction, relevant persons must still undertake a CRA on every customer to be acquired. It is noted that we can't do all of those CRAs really on day one, and therefore you can undertake these as soon as reasonably practicable, but you can utilise the CDD, you can utilise the CRA from the vendor, but use those to embed them into your own sort of customer risk framework. What you'll need to do is you will need to understand the vendor's CRA procedures and risk classifications. So you can't rely on the vendor's CRA going forward, but you can use it, and you can use the CDD they provide you to help embed that business into your own. There must be a plan in place and sort of a planned timeline of how that embedding is going to take place. So as I've mentioned, each measure has its own conditions. You need to look at the code and look at the handbook, but in summary, we've just pulled out a few of the common ones. In all cases, the CRA, the customer risk assessment, is still required. The concessions are really around the customer due diligence, the CDD. In most of the concessions, you need to have evidenced that the customer or the scenario is not higher risk in respect of money laundering and terrorist financing. And each concession then has specific conditions to be met, including testing in some cases. So a couple of examples we've pulled out are the acting on behalf of and the eligible introducer, where there is terms of business and there's testing requirements in place. As I've mentioned already, all other code requirements continue to apply. and you need not have identified any suspicious activity. If this happens, the use of the concession does fall away. Where you determine, based on risk, it's appropriate to use simplified due diligence, please ensure it's documented and rationalised. And this data is also required to be submitted on your AML return. And that's to give us indication of which concessions are being used more than others. And you can see some of that data in the NRA 2026. So in summary, being able to use simplified due diligence is really integral to operating a risk-based approach. In order for it to be risk-based, you must identify and assess your risks. The concept is to allow more proportionate controls to lower risk customers and lower risk scenarios. So as we've discussed, it's beneficial to the firm from a time and resourcing perspective, allowing you to spend more time on your higher risk customers. It's beneficial to the customer. It gives them a smoother onboarding process. And it's beneficial for us as a jurisdiction because we're supporting financial inclusion and reducing the barriers for lower risk individuals and entities, therefore encouraging participation in our financial system. So I hope that has been of use. It was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the use of simplified measures, just as a bit of a refresh. I am going to pop an email address on screen and happy to take any questions if you want to submit them to the AML inbox. And we are also happy to run any further sessions on some of those concessions that we have mentioned today. And finally, I just want to remind you of some of the FSA webinars that we've got in our library that we're building up online. You can see some of the topics there on screen. We've got some recent ones on sanctions compliance, MLTF risk assessments. We've also got some presentations that we did at the Manx Museum on the new National Risk Assessment and a series on proliferation financing. So we really would encourage you to have a look at these varied webinars and share them with your staff. So as I mentioned, that is the end of today's session, and please do get in touch with any questions you might have. So thank you for listening, and we'll speak soon.